On the coldest winter night, when every door had slammed shut, Mrs. Eleanor clung to her last hope, a fragile little life fading in her arms. The world seemed to turn its back on her until, in the heart of the snowstorm, she met an unexpected savior, a kind black woman who brought light not only to the dying kitten, but to Eleanor's heart as well. Part 2. When Meaning Falls Silent. In a small apartment on the third floor of an old building in Southside Chicago, warmth quietly crept through the weathered wooden seams, thanks to the faint hum of the space heater in the corner. Near the fogged-up window sat a woven basket lined with a faded scarf, where a tiny creature curled up, breathing softly. Snowy. That was the name Mrs. Eleanor gave to the stray kitten she found on that freezing night near the corner cafe, the Quiet Corner, as if it were the only miracle winter had offered her this year. Each morning she carefully prepared breakfast for the both of them. On the table, a small dish of warm milk and a few pieces of shredded tuna delicately placed beside a chipped white bowl. Nearby, a cup of Earl Grey tea gave off a gentle scent, laced with thyme. Snowy was still fragile, but its eyes were less cloudy now, opening slowly whenever she came near. Once it lifted its head and gently nudged her wrinkled hand. A tiny gesture, but to Eleanor, it was like a hug, a response, a thread quietly tying two lonely hearts together. She talked to it as if it could understand everything, told it stories about her husband, Robert, the man who left during that silent spring of the pandemic. She told it about the long nights alone, the cups of tea with no one to share, the memories no one was left to remember. And Snowy, though voiceless, simply lay there, occasionally lifting its amber eyes to meet hers, soft as twilight. In the aging room, something had begun to stir again, a bit of warmth, a bit of peace, and a great deal of hope. But then, one morning, everything changed. Snowy didn't come out of the basket as usual. It lay curled, head bowed low, breathing short and quick, eyes half shut, body trembling. When she set the food dish down, it didn't move. "Snowy?" she called softly, then again her voice beginning to tremble. No response. She knelt, placing a hand on its rough fur. It was still warm, but its breathing sounded as though it was pulling an entire winter through every tiny gasp. Lethargic, weak, fading. Fear gripped her, a cold more brutal than any winter. She realized if Snowy died, she would be back to where she started, alone. But this time it would be worse, because this time she had allowed herself to hope. The kitten wasn't just a stray. It was the only reason she got up in the mornings, the reason she prepared food, combed her hair, folded her blanket, and dared to speak aloud the thoughts she used to keep buried inside. Snowy was purpose, the last flicker tying her to this world. And now, with each labored breath of the kitten, it felt like that thread was breaking. She looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall. Not the kind that drifts gently like in storybooks. This was a real storm, thick white sheets battering the windows, shaking everything calm loose. She grabbed her phone. Her hands trembled. Her heart raced. Which vet clinic was still open? Who would help? Snowy couldn't wait. From the old radio, a slow voice echoed. "A record-breaking snowstorm is expected to hit Chicago tonight. Residents are advised to stay indoors unless necessary." Cold, alone, desperate. The words wrapped around Mrs. Eleanor once more, like they always had. And in the basket, the tiny kitten, breathing with effort, seemed to say, "Don't give up. Not after you didn't give up on me." Outside Eleanor's tiny apartment window, the snowstorm howled like a wounded beast. Wind slashed through every crack in the old wooden frames, driving thick sheets of snow against the brittle walls. Chicago was swallowed in white, a quiet, brutal world muffled under winter's heavy hand. In the kitchen, lit only by a weak yellow bulb, Eleanor sat trembling, cradling the small kitten she had rescued just hours ago. She'd named him Ray. But the warmth she'd felt when she first held him had already begun to slip away. Ray didn't leap into her lap like he had the night before. He barely lifted his head toward the bowl of warm milk she had placed nearby. His damp fur shivered uncontrollably, his breathing shallow and uneven. Each fragile mule felt like a needle to Eleanor's chest. Her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. She dialed the first number in her faded, dog-eared phone book, a vet clinic just down the street. A voice answered, cold, mechanical. "We're closed due to weather conditions." She tried another. "We only accept pets with medical records or insurance." Another. "No new patients without an appointment, especially not during a storm like this." Each reply struck her like a slap. It wasn't just rejection, it was the sound of the world turning its back. Hope shrank in her chest like a flame caught in the wind. She looked down at Ray, this small flicker of life she had pulled from the darkness. He was fading fast. And she knew then she couldn't just sit and watch. She wouldn't. With a kind of quiet defiance only the desperate know, Eleanor wrapped her fraying scarf tighter around her neck, tucked Ray inside her coat, and stepped into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall, snow blinding and thick. She bent low against it, her boots dragging, leaving uneven prints in the frozen white. No taxi would answer. No buses ran. No cars passed. Just her and the fragile creature in her arms, alone in the unforgiving silence of the city. She walked, guided by memory and the fading ink of an address in her old phone book. With each block, she whispered a prayer, that it was still open, that someone would care. Her gloves were thin and worn. Her fingers burned, then went numb. The scarf froze stiff against her face. Then through the blur of white, a faint light appeared. A clinic, big, clean, still glowing. Her legs nearly gave out as she reached the door. She knocked. Once. Then again. Eventually, it opened just a crack. A young woman in scrubs stepped out, hair tied back, eyes wary. She looked Eleanor over, dripping hat, red-rimmed eyes, trembling arms wrapped tight around a bundle of struggling fur. "Please," Eleanor rasped. "He's dying. I don't have much, but I can pay slowly. Work it off, anything." The woman didn't flinch. Her voice was soft, but her tone offered no mercy. "I'm sorry. We only accept registered pets, and our vet isn't here due to the storm. We can't take new cases tonight." "But he's—" Eleanor choked on her words. She simply held Ray tighter. Her tears melted into the snow. "I really am sorry." Then the nurse gently, but firmly, closed the door. Click. It echoed louder than it should have, like the world slamming shut. Eleanor stood in the snow, shrinking into herself. The wind screamed around her like a thing alive. She was just an old woman, poor and forgotten, and this kitten, her last companion, was slipping away in her arms. That night,
As the storm raged on, it wasn't the cold that hurt most. It was the indifference.
Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the street, her body numb from the cold. Snow and wind battered her from every direction, blurring the line between sidewalk and road. Each step sank deep into the heavy snow. Each breath tore at her chest like shards of glass. She held Ray tightly against her chest, the little kitten now lying motionless inside the damp wool of her scarf. His body felt weightless, fragile, as if it might dissolve at any moment in her arms. She looked around. The streets were deserted. No footsteps, no headlights, only flickering street lamps and the wind howling through the shuttered high-rises. She didn't know where she was, didn't know which direction to take, didn't know who to call anymore. A wave of dizziness hit her. She collapsed to her knees, sinking into the snow. Her heart thudded slowly, painfully, tight with fear, with exhaustion, with the quiet grief of someone who has reached the farthest edge of her strength. And then, a new sound. An engine. From the distance, a pair of headlights pierced the swirling snow. A black SUV slowed and pulled over to the curb. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. Tall, sturdy, worry etched across her face. Her curly hair was tucked under a knit hat, her coat dusted in snow. Her eyes widened as they landed on the small, hunched figure curled beneath the street lamp. It was Dr. Emma. She had just finished a long shift at the emergency animal clinic on the west side, heading home, a drive she hadn't expected would bring her to this moment. "Ma'am," Emma called, urgent. "Are you okay?" Eleanor looked up slowly. Her eyes were red, from the cold and from the tears she could no longer control. She didn't speak. She simply loosened her scarf, revealing the tiny, still kitten in her arms. Emma stepped closer, knelt down to meet her at eye level. She didn't ask questions, she didn't need to. Her eyes said everything: recognition, compassion, calm. She had seen this before, hundreds of times. Desperate creatures clinging to life. And now, here was another. "Come with me," she said softly but firmly. "We can't stay out here. I'll take a look at him." Emma helped Eleanor to her feet, gently lifting her stiff, shivering body. The car door shut behind them, cutting off the storm. Inside the vehicle, the air was cramped but warm, and for Eleanor, it was the first place that hadn't made her feel like she didn't belong. Under the dim yellow light of the cabin, Dr. Emma reached into the back seat, pulling out a small medical kit, a stethoscope, a thermometer, a practiced hand, calm, quick, and precise, but always gentle. "Breathing's weak, but still there. He's likely hypothermic. Good thing you wrapped him up so well." Eleanor said nothing. She sat quietly, fingers clenched, lips tight, eyes fixed on Emma's every move as if watching a miracle unfold, one heartbeat at a time. "We need to get to the clinic. It's less than 10 minutes from here. I've got heating pads, IV fluids, everything he needs." Eleanor could hardly believe it. Just minutes ago, she'd stood in the middle of the storm, hopeless and invisible. Now a door had opened, not of promises or empty sympathy, but of action, of kindness, of someone who didn't turn away. She nodded slowly. Tears streamed down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't from the cold. Emma gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze and turned back to the wheel. The SUV pulled onto the snow-covered road, its headlights cutting through the storm. And inside, a woman and a kitten, two fragile lives clinging to warmth, moved toward the only place still lit by compassion on a bitter winter night. Dr. Emma's clinic sat on a quiet street, almost hidden from the city map by layers of snow. The glass doors were fogged with cold, but inside the lights stayed on through the night, soft and steady, like the warmth of a kind heart. Eleanor sat alone in the hallway. The old wooden bench creaked beneath her every shift, but she didn't care. In front of her was a closed door. Behind it, Dr. Emma was working on Ray. She had no idea how long she'd been waiting. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second stretching into the next like an eternity. Outside, the wind still blew, the snow still fell, but inside this small hidden room, in the heart of the storm, Eleanor no longer felt alone. No one had asked her if she had money. No one had looked twice at her frayed coat, her messy silver hair, and her swollen, tear-stained eyes. There was only quiet kindness, unspoken, unconditional. From time to time, Emma cracked the door to ask for a fluid bag or another tool. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The look she gave Eleanor, steady, understanding, was enough to hold her together. As dawn neared, the storm began to break. Light crept across the gray horizon. The snow stopped. The white-laced branches outside the clinic windows began to shimmer faintly in the first light of day. Then the phone on the hallway desk rang. Eleanor flinched. She picked it up and heard Emma's voice on the other end. "Mrs. Eleanor? He's stable now. You can come in and see him." Eleanor rose slowly. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of a feeling too soft, too sudden to name. The door opened. There, on a blanket of white cotton towels, lay Ray. Curled up, eyes half open, still tired, still weak, but awake. His ears twitched faintly as she stepped in. Emma gave a small smile, nodding gently as if affirming a quiet truth. "He's going to be okay. He just needs time and love." Eleanor walked closer, fingers brushing gently over the kitten's head. A small meow rose from him, fragile but real. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Emma just smiled and gave her shoulder a soft pat. "You walked through the storm with him. That's the real miracle." When Eleanor stepped out of the clinic with Ray in her arms, the first sunlight after the storm broke between the tall buildings. A pale golden glow spilled onto the snow-covered street, like candlelight across a frozen world. She walked slowly, pressing the kitten to her chest. The wind still bit at her skin, but deep inside, a quiet warmth had taken root, as if a small fire had been lit somewhere in the long winter of her soul. It wasn't just the life of a fragile creature that had been saved. It was something else too, something she thought she'd lost. A belief that no matter how cold the world becomes, there are still people who will pull over in a snowstorm just to hold on to someone who's slipping away. Ray's story was only just beginning, and Eleanor knew, from this day forward, she wouldn't face the winter alone.